Europe Day this year, students from Styria are invited to deal with some important topics of the European Union. It's, for example, about artificial intelligence or about the topic No Planet B. Young people receive with this video expert input on each topic and then formulate demands on the Commission for their perspective. Our expert now for the topic No Planet B is Andrew Ringsmuth, working at the University of Graz at the Wegener Center for Climate and Global Change. Scientist for sustainability, a researcher in complex systems, works on sustainable energy technologies. And I would like to ask you for a short introduction. You were born in Australia, lived on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. When you found out there's something to do against the climate change, I think you were 17 years old.
That's right. Yes, that's what I wrote. Yeah, so I was 17, and I read a book called The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, right, referring to fossil fuels, and it woke me up to the fact that we are, as a civilization, are completely dependent on fossil fuels, and this was a shock to me because I had some kind of awareness that we had environmental problems. But I thought that doing things like recycling my garbage and picking up rubbish from the ground or whatever, that was an adequate level of response. And this really let me know that that was not adequate, and that we had much larger problems surrounding energy and the climate.
So you also studied in the Netherlands, now in Vienna and in Graz. When you would describe how is our Earth doing right now?
Our Earth is changing so quickly that from a geological perspective, you know, where we're used to thinking in terms of millions and hundreds of millions of years, the changes are basically instantaneous. And it's hard for us to see as humans because our lives are quite short compared to the timescales of the Earth. But the changes that we're undergoing now are really dramatic. And we're reaching a point where, we're really in a state of emergency now. And if we don't act at the required scale to slow down our carbon emissions and to reduce the loss of biodiversity, it's quite likely that we'll arrive at tipping points where it's beyond human control, and all future generations of humanity will be affected profoundly by that. So if you'd like me to run through some numbers, I can do that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. So global average temperature is changing now at about 170 times faster than over the last 7,000 years, in the upwards direction, of course. And if anything, from the position of the Earth in its orbit and from the current low level of solar activity, if anything, we'd be expecting reductions in temperature. But the temperatures are rising extremely quickly. Climate scientists like to think of the Earth as being made up of a number of what they call tipping elements. So things like the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, the Amazon rainforest. These are large, significant systems in the Earth which are interconnected. And current knowledge suggests that as these things tip over from one state into another state, they affect each other, and eventually the whole planet will likely tip over into a state. Which would leave us with a planet that's not habitable to humans, or at least large parts of the planet would not be habitable to humans. And we're not there yet. The window is still open, but we're getting dangerously close. So, for example, the Amazon may be approaching a tipping point where it's likely to turn into a savanna. Right? This is the largest, richest area of biodiversity on the planet. If it does tip over into a savanna, then it'll release a huge amount of carbon, and of course, we'll lose all that amazing biodiversity, but then that will have knock-on effects on the other Earth tipping elements. Greenland ice sheet also looks like it's approaching such a tipping element. The West Antarctic ice sheet may already be there. So we really don't have any time to waste. It looks like 9 of 15 planetary tipping points look like they're on the move. And this is a dramatic change. So sometimes skeptical people like to say the Earth has always changed, but and they're right, of course, it has always changed. But for the last 3 million years, it's only changed within a very narrow range, and it's never exceeded more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels of temperature. And we're now on track to exceed that within 30 to 40 years. So the rates of change that we're looking at now are dramatic compared to anything that we've seen, certainly within human history.
Mm. So if you say we don't have any time, does this mean we have maybe until 2030, because there are some programs that figure out this year 2030 to have changed some things? Is this enough time, or should we change everything now?
Well, changing everything now is the same as changing things by 2030, because we've built for ourselves an enormous global economy, a huge system, which assumes many things like ongoing economic growth, for example. And we need to change things dramatically at a rate that has never been seen before. So there's no precedent in human history for the scale of the change that we have to undertake. So we know that we need to halve carbon emissions within the next 10 years. So by 2030, we need to be emitting 50% less carbon, and we need to have stopped the loss of biodiversity, which is currently at between 10 and 10,000, depending on how you measure and where you measure. 10 to 10,000 times what we call the background rate, so how it was going before humans came along.
So what do you think? What would happen if we continue like this? What are the consequences?
So we're on track to reach 1.5 degrees warming within 20 to 30 years, if I remember correctly. So let me correct myself. Between 2030 and 2050, and then 2 degrees between 2060 to 2070. And each of those levels represents a kind of new level of consequence. So at 1.5 to 2 degrees, by the way, we're now at about 1.1 degrees. So at 1.5 to 2, we can expect more extreme weather. Of course, we're already seeing that, right? I mean, when I read that book that we talked about, all these things seemed still quite distantly in the future. It was just an imagined world. But now we're already seeing this, and I think young people are aware of this. So at 1.5, more extreme weather, economic and food systems will be disrupted. So this means, of course, that largely the people who are not responsible for these effects, that means the large fraction of the world's population that is not industrialized and that is poorer, will suffer the brunt of these effects. And then we'll see things like increasing levels of climate refugees. You know, Europe thinks we have a refugee problem now, but it's probably nothing compared to what we would likely see if temperatures continue to rise in the tropical region, agricultural systems fail, and people have no option but to migrate towards the poles. So that's at 1.5 to 2 degrees, and 2 degrees is thought to be likely the tipping point at which we will probably set off irreversible feedbacks, interactions between those critical tipping systems where it moves beyond human control. So above 2 to 3 degrees, really we probably lose the Antarctic glaciers, the Greenland ice sheet, the permafrost, which is already melting due to the ongoing increases in temperature in the Arctic. And so from there we could be facing a new world with 10 meters sea level rise, and hundreds of millions of people, if not billions, live on coastlines around the world. So if the sea level rises by 10 meters, I mean that's a complete change in what the human world looks like. It's really hard to imagine what things will actually unfold like, but it won't be easy.
So in your opinion, what has to happen to stop the climate change? Can each individual contribute to this? What can we all do?
Sure. So and we know that we need to halve emissions by 2030. So we need to stop emissions by 2050, right? The amount of warming that we get is proportional to, right, depends on the total amount of emissions that we make. So we have a carbon budget and we have to use up as little of it as possible. So to halve emissions by 2030, that means reducing emissions at something like 7% per year. And now we kind of, I know it doesn't feel very lucky, but we kind of got lucky in 2020 with the corona crisis, because at least in terms of emissions, of course, it was tragic in other ways. Because the emissions reduction in 2020 was 6.3%, it was estimated at. So that's roughly the level of change that we need. But rather than having it enforced on us by a pandemic, we need to be enforcing that on ourselves. And, you know, many of us maybe have this idea that we need to return to the world of before, you know, I agree, it's not so much fun having to stay at home all the time, but the reduction in industrial activity and travel and so on that emits carbon dioxide is at about the level that we need to sustain. And we don't need to just hold it here. We need to actually continue to reduce by the same fraction each year all the way to 2030. So the first thing to do as an individual is probably to get your head around the kind of changes that are required. You know, we still, and maybe as individuals and as certainly as nations and as a planet, we still are hanging on to this idea of incremental changes where we can just make some small change, make something a little bit more efficient, maybe change a law a little bit, and that'll be enough. But it won't be enough. You know, we know that we need this dramatic exponential reduction. All right, all countries need to reduce their emissions by 6 to 7% each year and to 2030. And we're making efforts, but they're not dramatic enough. So I have a list here of things that perhaps as a global community that we can do. So first, you know, we need to stop all investments in fossil fuels, right? We are still in large parts of the world investing in fossil fuels, and we're subsidizing fossil fuel extraction actually and consumption to the rate of about 500 billion per year. And we give tax exemptions to companies for burning fossil fuels. I mean, this is exactly the opposite of what we need to be doing, right? Mm-hmm. Broadly, we need to be taxing the things we don't want and incentivizing the things that we do want. We need to do things like making the European Green Deal a reality. And I mean, I'm not an expert on the legal framework or the economics of that proposal, but bold political objectives in that direction are definitely the way that we need to be going. We need to transition our food system, which is currently a huge greenhouse emitter and destructive to ecosystems. And one of the major emitters that needs to be reformed. We need to safeguard all remaining biodiversity and get serious about ending what some people call ecocide, right? The destruction of ecosystems with legislation. And we need to lock the financial system within planetary boundaries. So global markets are still putting money into fossil fuels. Many of our pension funds still depend on fossil fuels, but the divestment movement is gaining momentum, and that's exciting. Right, you asked me about individuals. So this is tricky, right? And of course, the students who are hearing this probably want to know what they can do. The first thing to do, of course, is to educate yourself, right? I know these realities can sound scary, but hiding from them is not going to change them. The first thing to do is to find out what's really going on, and then talk to other people about it, because your actions and your dialogue go beyond yourself. It can be very easy to think, oh, I'm just one person and I can't really change much, but we live in a complex system, right? And in a complex system, the behavior of the system is more than the sum of the parts. So through the interconnections between the parts of the system, when one part changes, it can change many other parts of the system. And so we can reach what people call social tipping points, right? We talked about planetary tipping points, but what we need to do now is reach social and economic tipping points where small incremental changes reach a point where the system suddenly rapidly changes. And we have precedent for this, right? It seems like in many cases, you only need something like 20% of the population to reach a point, right? To change their behavior, to want something new, and then the whole system can tip over. So that's a cause for hope. In terms of practical lifestyle changes, our diets are large sources of emissions. So switching to a largely plant-based diet and buying food that's locally produced can make a big change. Avoiding driving as much as possible. Now, I mean, I remember when I was a teenager, I was excited about getting a car and getting out there and having my freedom. These days, I don't have a car. I haven't had for some time. I have a bicycle and I try to ride and walk everywhere. And really, that's the kind of personal mobility, especially in Europe, where the cities are, where they're developed before the car, so they're all quite easily navigable by foot or by bike. And of course, taking public transport if it's too far to walk or bike, and only driving when it's really essential. And so something like joining an electric car sharing program or something like that, if you want to be able to drive. I mean, that's about the limit probably of what we can assume to be healthy personal mobility habits. Flying, of course, is the activity that emits the most carbon dioxide per time. Look, I know we live in a world where maybe sometimes it's absolutely unavoidable to fly, but most of the time, we can find a way around it. And it can be nice to enjoy a train ride. And if you need to get something done, you can use the time in the train. Now there's Wi-Fi on most trains. So avoiding flying is a big thing. Looking forward into your life, we've all grown up in a time where we're used to things getting bigger, more advanced, moving faster, and we all hope to get richer, right? We have these cultural narratives that we should all try to get as rich as possible, and that's the best life you can live. But we know that the richer people are, the more carbon dioxide they emit. So the richer you want to get, the more emissions you want to produce. And it can help to realize that in Europe, even with a middle-class income, let's say you become a school teacher or the kind of normal professions that we think of as basic middle-class jobs, even with that level of income, we're still in the richest 2 to 3% of humans on the planet, right? We are still in this tiny little bubble of wealth. And most of the people on this planet have so much less than we do. We're not in any position to tell them that they have to stop emitting, because in some cases it can really lift them out of a level of poverty that none of us would want on our worst enemies. But we who already live such comfortable, rich lives, maybe need to consider that we're already rich enough, and continuing to consume more and emit more is perhaps not wise, even for ourselves in the medium term. Within years to decades, we're facing very serious consequences even in the rich world. So shopping for fun may be a habit that we need to leave in the past. And I would say, finally, get politically active. It's so exciting now to see the Fridays for Future movement and Extinction Rebellion, people getting out in the streets and demanding change. We all need to be doing more of that. And we have political representatives who are there to represent us. I know it's easy to get cynical and assume that they won't do their jobs, but if we actually make the effort to first, an easy thing to do is to email a representative, but maybe they don't pay so much attention to that. If you call them, they'll pay. I remember something like a politician pays about, or assumes that a phone call represents 10 times more people than an email represents. And if you actually go and visit your representative, that's about another 10 times again. So if you just make a call and then go and book an appointment with these people and talk to them and tell them what you want done, technically it's their job to listen and do something, and it's not so hard to do.
Thanks for this. So far, you just mentioned the COVID crisis. Nowadays, it seems all environmental problems are less important due to the COVID crisis. Do you think so?
Well, I agree that it seems maybe like they're less important because we're distracted with something, but it doesn't mean that they're less important.
Okay.
Our emissions reduced by, as I said, I think it was 6.3% last year, and that is heading in the direction that we need, but technically it's still not quite far enough, and we are still emitting too much carbon dioxide, and the Earth is still heading in the direction that it's been heading in, which is that we're on track to arrive at 3-4 degrees of warming by the end of the century, which basically locks us into a world that we can't live in. So I know that we've faced these big changes, and we need to focus on keeping ourselves healthy and dealing with the consequences in our personal lives and in our economies. But we can also see this as a huge opportunity, right? Some people call it the opportunity to build back better. And I mean, this is really, I think in decades to come, if we don't take this opportunity, people will look back and shake their heads and say, that was a perfectly timed head start. What were you thinking if you didn't grab that opportunity and run with it? People have really, we've adjusted to a new way of life. We're not moving around so much. We've realized that we have these incredible digital technologies like we're using right now that allow us to still remain social, and many of us still to work, even without having to go into the office every day. This is a springboard that we can really use to start taking the level of transformative action required. So yeah, use it and tell your politicians that they need to use it.
Soweit also die Ausführungen unseres Experten zum Thema No Planet B. Also wir haben keinen zweiten Planeten und wir haben auch schon gehört, wir müssen schnell was tun, wir müssen bald was tun und da ist jeder von uns gefordert, jeder Einzelne. Ich begrüße an der Stelle jetzt auch Wolfgang Bogensberger von der Europäischen Kommission. Einen wunderschönen Tag. Der European Green Deal, man hört immer wieder davon. Was wird denn seitens der Kommission schon getan? Was wird noch in Angriff genommen? Grüß Gott einmal.
Grüß Gott, vielen Dank, dass ich bei euch dabei sein kann und auch vielen Dank für dieses extrem spannende Thema. Das ist vielleicht das allerwichtigste Thema in den nächsten Jahren und Jahrzehnten und es ist schön mit diesem Titel No Planet B auf den Punkt gebracht. Wir haben in der Tat keinen zweiten Planeten im Kofferraum. Wir müssen mit der einen Welt, die wir haben, mehr als sorgsam umgehen. Und das Ziel ist, dass wir nicht nur heute und ihr morgen, sondern auch noch die Generationen, die nach euch kommen, und das mögen möglichst viele sein, eine lebenswerte und eine liebenswerte Welt vorfinden. Die äh, das wichtigste Thema ist vielleicht der Klimaschutz. Das hat die oberste Priorität in der Politik der Europäischen Kommission. Es ist das wichtigste Ziel, das uns in den nächsten Jahren und Jahrzehnten vor den Augen steht, wozu wir gute Lösungen finden sollen. Und das Werkzeug, um dieses Ziel zu erreichen, das ist der europäische Grüne Deal oder EU Green Deal. Der strebt Änderungen in fast allen Lebensbereichen vor. Die Art, wie wir leben, die Art, wie wir arbeiten, wie wir reisen, Urlaub machen, wie wir transportieren etc. Alles wird von diesem Green Deal erfasst werden. Und dieses Ziel des Klimaschutzes, und darüber sind sich mittlerweile fast alle Menschen in Europa eines Sinnes. Dieses Ziel kann nur erreicht werden, wenn wir alle gemeinsam da anpacken, wenn wir diese Herausforderung, die durch den Klimaschutz entsteht, durch den Umweltschutz entsteht, dass wir das auch als Chance sehen, etwas zu ändern. Und da ist der zentrale Begriff der Nachhaltigkeit. Es ist klar, das fällt nicht allen gleichermaßen leicht, das Verhalten zu ändern, manchen leichter als anderen. Wir müssen daher Acht geben, dass niemand zurückgelassen wird, dass alle dabei sind, dass alle das als eine Chance und als eine Perspektive sehen. Worum geht es konkret? Im Wesentlichen will Europa der erste klimaneutrale Kontinent werden. Europa möchte im Jahr 2050 nicht mehr Treibhausgasemissionen freisetzen, als es abbauen kann. Das ist ein sehr anspruchsvolles Ziel, aber es ist noch anspruchsvoller, weil 2050, das ist noch sehr weit weg, bis zum Jahr 2030, also in weniger als in 9 Jahren, sollen diese Treibhausgasemissionen bereits um mindestens 55% reduziert werden. Dazu wird es ein eigenes Klimagesetz geben. Das heißt, dieses politische Ziel wird mit einer rechtlichen Verpflichtung begleitet werden, die auch vor Gericht einklappbar wird. Das heißt, von der Zeit der schönen Plänen und Reden werden wir jetzt in die Phase des Handelns übergehen. Es wird ernsthaft. Was bedeutet das konkret? Beseitigung der Umweltverschmutzung. Also wir brauchen sauberes Wasser, wir brauchen saubere Luft, wir brauchen die Flüsse, Seen, Feuchtgebiete, Biotope, brauchen kein Plastik drin, da muss das Plastik überall beseitigt werden. Wir brauchen eine Luftqualität, die nicht von Feinstaubbelastung angereichert ist. Wir brauchen eine Verringerung der Luftverschmutzung durch Industrieanlagen. Wir brauchen bessere Verhütung von Schäden, die durch Unfälle passieren in Industrieanlagen etc. Eine weitere ganz wichtige Politik wird sein, dass man versucht, die Nachhaltigkeit in der gesamten Lebensmittelkette sorgsam herzustellen. Das nennt sich vom Hof bis zum Tisch, also von der Produktion von Lebensmitteln bis letztlich zum Konsum dieser Lebensmittel. Was nutzt es zum Beispiel, wenn wir zwar Bio-Äpfel haben, diese aber dann in Plastik verpackt werden, mit umweltbelastenden Transporten über tausende Kilometer durch die Gegend transportiert werden, und wenn dann noch viel davon gekauft wird und die Hälfte davon wieder weggeschmissen wird, das ist ein im Grunde nicht akzeptabler Missbrauch unserer Ressourcen. Das heißt, wir müssen da in der gesamten Produktionskette durchschauen, wo können wir Nachhaltigkeit einfließen lassen. Das ist im Bereich der Landwirtschaft, Einsatz von Pestiziden soll verringert werden, Einsatz von Düngemitteln soll verringert werden, Antibiotikaverwendung in der Viehzucht soll geringer werden, Biobauern sollen gefördert werden. Die Transporte der Lebensmittel sollen nachhaltig sein. Wenn wir im Geschäft dann einkaufen, soll es auch erkennbar sein, was ist nachhaltig produziert und transportiert worden. Und dann ganz wichtig natürlich auch die Bekämpfung der Lebensmittelverschwendung im Handel und bei den Verbrauchern. Es wird unglaublich viel Lebensmittel weggeworfen. Das ist ein echter Frevel, und es ist ihm letztlich auch ein unsinniger Umgang mit Ressourcen. Da müssen wir schauen, dass wir von diesen sinnlosen Verhaltensformen auch wegkommen. Und vielleicht den dritten Bereich, der auch ganz wichtig ist: Wir brauchen diese Nachhaltigkeit in unserem Alltagsleben. Die Gebäude, äh, die Mobilität, die Energieproduktion, all diese Aspekte sollen im Wesentlichen von Nachhaltigkeit gekennzeichnet sein. Europa muss den Verkehrssektor äh, energierationaler, energieeffizienter gestalten. Wir brauchen viel mehr Elektromobilität. Mit dem Green Deal sollen die Emissionen bis um 90%, die vom Verkehr ausgestoßen werden, gesenkt werden bis 2050. Das ist schon ziemlich viel, und da braucht es viele gemeinsame Anstrengungen. Wir brauchen auch eine sehr stärkere Verwendung der öffentlichen Verkehrsmittel. Dieses Jahr ist zum Beispiel das Europäische Jahr der Schiene. Wir brauchen die Entlastung des Straßenverkehrs. In der Steiermark gibt es zum Beispiel jetzt auch ganz stark von der Europäischen Union geförderte Förderprojekte für den Bahnverkehr. Einerseits der Semmering-Tunnel, andererseits der Koralm-Tunnel. Also da gehen die Investitionen schon in die richtige Richtung. Und letztlich müssen wir dann auch schauen, dass wir von der Energieproduktion in die sogenannten erneuerbaren Energien umsteigen können. Das ist Windkraft, das ist Wasserkraft, das ist Sonnenenergie, das ist aber auch Wasserstoff. Wir müssen rauskommen von Kohle, Erdöl, Erdgas, damit wir die Emissionen tatsächlich bis zum Jahr 2050 so weit reduzieren können, dass wir klimaneutral werden können. Also, es ist viel zu tun. Es ist ein sehr, sehr spannendes Thema, und ich würde vorschlagen, gehen wir es an, alle gemeinsam. Wir haben in der Tat keinen Plan B.
Herr Bogensberger, jetzt muss ich trotzdem auch noch mal
Ja.
nachfragen. Sie haben uns ganz viele Punkte aufgezählt, wo bereits gearbeitet wird, wo bereits ganz konkret Dinge umgesetzt werden. Was wäre denn aus Ihrer ganz persönlichen Sicht der wichtigste Beitrag, den jeder Einzelne leisten kann? Sie haben gesagt, wir alle gemeinsam müssen tun. Wir alle gemeinsam, das ist so ein schönes Konglomerat. Da fühlt sich dann vielleicht auch nicht jeder doch angesprochen. Aber was kann denn jeder Einzelne wirklich tun? Was wäre der sinnvollste Beitrag aus Ihrer persönlichen Erfahrung?
Also fast alle in Europa sind bereit, in ihrer Lebensführung etwas zu ändern. Aber was jeder sehr leicht tun kann, ist, Plastiksackerln sind nahezu schon der Vergangenheit an beim Einkaufen. Es verwendet fast jeder wiederverwendbare Einkaufstaschen. Äh, eine ganz wichtige Facette ist: Brauchen wir wirklich so viel Fleischkonsum? Also der Fleischkonsum ist einer der stärksten Sorgenkinder auch, weil Tiere vielfach Methan produzieren, und die sind extrem belastend für unsere Luft. Äh, Radfahren statt mit dem Auto, zu Fuß gehen, mit der Straßenbahn fahren, mit dem Zug fahren, wo es immer nur geht. Also schauen, wo kann ich meinen persönlichen Fußabdruck, was die Belastung des Klimas betrifft, reduzieren. Und wenn man da ein bisschen sensibel ist und allmählich auch schon die Möglichkeiten sich genauer anschaut, was kann ich selbst dazu beitragen, ich bin überrascht, wie kreativ und erfindungsreich und auch beispielgebend, insbesondere die Jungen sind. Die gehen in dem Bereich in Wirklichkeit voran und setzen uns Erwachsene vielfach unter Druck und fragen, brauchen wir das wirklich?
Mhm.
Müssen wir das wirklich machen, etc. Also ich vertraue ganz auf euch. Ihr seid da die wichtigste Innovationskraft, Erneuerungskraft und ihr werdet das schaffen.